Find out what really crashed in the New Mexico desert in 1947 and why the U.S. military retracted its own story within 24 hours. Chapter 1: A Rancher's Discovery. Something fell from the sky. The summer of 1947 was unlike any other in American history. World War II had ended less than 2 years before, leaving the nation simultaneously triumphant and haunted. The atomic age had dawned in a blinding flash over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the men who had unleashed that power were now locked in a cold, grinding standoff with the Soviet Union. Paranoia was not a disorder. It was a rational response to a world suddenly capable of annihilating itself. Citizens scanned the skies not just for Soviet bombers, but for something else entirely, something that had no name yet, something that arrived from directions that made no sense, moving in ways no known aircraft could manage. The phrase "flying saucer" had entered the American vocabulary barely 3 weeks before the events at Roswell, coined by newspapers interpreting private pilot Kenneth Arnold's account of 9 crescent-shaped objects skimming the ridgeline near Mount Rainier, Washington, at speeds he estimated at 1,200 miles per hour. Within days, thousands of similar sightings were reported across the country. The skies were alive with something, and on a remote ranch in the high desert of New Mexico, the something came down. William Mac Brazel was a practical man, the kind of man the American West produced in abundance. He managed the Foster Ranch, a sprawling expanse of scrubland and dust roughly 75 miles north of the small city of Roswell in Lincoln County, New Mexico. He was not a man given to flights of fancy or sensational claims. He spent his days doing what ranchers did, checking on livestock, mending fences, riding the land. So when he rode out in late June or July 1947, the exact date would become disputed, and discovered a field of debris unlike anything he had ever seen, he did not immediately run to the newspapers. He stopped his horse, he dismounted, he knelt in the dust, and picked up fragments of material that should not have existed on a New Mexico ranch, and his weathered face creased with something between confusion and unease. The debris field was enormous. It stretched across hundreds of feet of scrubland, a scar across the earth, as if something enormous had skipped across the surface before tearing itself apart. The material itself defied easy categorization. There were thin sheets of something that resembled metallic foil, but unlike any foil Brazel had encountered, it could not be crumpled. You could wad it into a ball in your fist, and when you released your hand, it would unfold itself back to its original shape, perfectly smooth, as if nothing had happened. There were beam-like pieces, lightweight as balsa wood, but impossibly strong, bearing strange markings, geometric symbols that looked, to some observers, like a form of writing that no one could read. There were other fragments scattered among the scrub brush and cactus, some of them with a purplish sheen in the high desert sun, all of them alien in the most basic pre-extraterrestrial sense, foreign, unknown, wrong. Brazel gathered samples and rode to his neighbors Floyd and Loretta Proctor. He spread the fragments on their kitchen table, and the 3 of them turned them over in their hands, trying to make sense of what they were holding. The Proctors suggested the debris might be connected to the flying saucer stories that had been dominating the newspapers for weeks. Brazel was skeptical. He was not a man who read sensational headlines and saw the world through their lens, but he held the material in his hands, and he could not argue with what was in front of him.
This was not wreckage from any balloon he had ever seen, any aircraft he recognized, any piece of equipment that belonged to the ordinary catalog of human technology. For several days he sat on the knowledge, perhaps hoping for a rational explanation to present itself. None did. On July 6, 1947, Brazel drove into Roswell and walked into the office of Sheriff George Wilcox. He spread his samples across the sheriff's desk and said, in essence, "Something fell on my ranch, and I have no idea what it is." What happened next would set in motion a sequence of events that is still unfolding today. A chain reaction of revelations, retractions, cover stories, deathbed confessions, government reports, and congressional hearings that has lasted nearly 8 decades and shows no sign of resolution. The rancher's discovery on the Foster Ranch in the summer of 1947 did not just create a news story, it created a mythology.
It created a wound in the American public's trust of its own government. And it created, perhaps more than any other single event in modern history, the framework through which millions of people now understand the relationship between humanity and the cosmos. Something fell from the sky over New Mexico. The question of what it was has never been fully, satisfactorily answered. And the silence around that question is itself, to many investigators, the most damning evidence of all. Chapter 2: The Press Release That Changed Everything. There are moments in history that feel, in retrospect, like accidents, like the universe hiccuped and revealed something it was not supposed to reveal. July 8th, 1947 was one of those moments. On that morning, Lieutenant Walter Haut, the public information officer at Roswell Army Airfield, issued a press release that electrified the world. The statement was brief, official, and unambiguous. It announced that the 509th Bomb Group of the United States Air Forces had recovered a flying disc from a ranch in the Roswell area. Not a balloon, not wreckage of unknown origin, a flying disc. The most elite military unit in the world, the unit that had dropped the atomic bombs on Japan, had officially, in writing, on military letterhead, confirmed the recovery of a device that matched the description of the phenomena that had been capturing the public's imagination for weeks. To understand the magnitude of this statement, one must understand what the 509th Bomb Group represented. This was not some obscure regional garrison. This was the crown jewel of American air power, the unit entrusted with the nation's most terrible weapon, staffed by the most carefully selected and rigorously vetted officers in the Air Force. When these men spoke officially, the world listened, and they were saying, "We have it. We have a flying disc." The story moved across wire services with the speed of electricity. By the afternoon of July 8th, newspapers across the United States and around the world were running headlines that would have seemed like science fiction even a month earlier. Major Jesse Marcel was the man at the center of this story. The base intelligence officer was a decorated veteran, a man of impeccable credentials and a reputation for careful, analytical thinking. Marcel had driven out to the Foster Ranch with counterintelligence agent Captain Sheridan Cavett to examine the debris field firsthand. What Marcel saw there was compelling enough that on his way back to base, he made an unusual detour. He stopped at his home and woke his wife and his 11-year-old son, Jesse Marcel Jr. He wanted them to see what he had found. He spread fragments of the material on the kitchen floor in the early morning hours, and young Jesse Jr.,
who would go on to become a military officer and physician, and who would maintain his account with consistent detail until his death in 2013, held a beam covered in purple-hued hieroglyphic-like symbols and turned it over in his hands, unable to identify what he was looking at. Marcel Sr. told his family this was debris from a flying saucer. He then continued to the base and delivered the material to his commanding officer. Hours later, the press release went out.
But then, something remarkable happened. Within 24 hours, with almost supernatural speed, the story was retracted. Brigadier General Roger Ramey, the commanding officer of the 8th Air Force at Fort Worth, Texas, called a press conference. He displayed what he described as the actual recovered material, the crumpled remains of a weather balloon and its attached radar reflector, a flimsy kite-like device made of foil and balsa wood sticks. The photographs taken at that press conference show Jesse Marcel kneeling beside the debris, holding a piece of it. But Marcel would later say, and maintained until his death, that the material in those photographs was not what he had recovered from the Foster Ranch. It had been switched, substituted. The real material had been removed and replaced with a weather balloon, and Marcel had been ordered to pose with the substitute for the cameras. The flying saucer had become, officially, a weather balloon. The story was over. Except that it wasn't, not by a long measure. The speed of the retraction itself became, for researchers and investigators who would examine the case decades later, one of the most suspicious elements of the entire affair. Military press releases are not issued casually. They are vetted, approved, reviewed. For the 509th Bomb Group's public information officer to issue a statement identifying recovered debris as a flying disc, and for that statement to be reversed within 24 hours at the highest levels of the Air Force, suggests one of two things. Either there was a catastrophic failure of military procedure, or the initial statement was accurate and the correction was the lie. Researchers who have spent careers analyzing the Roswell case have argued that the first explanation is almost inconceivable. What changed between July 8th and July 9th, 1947 was not the facts. What changed was the decision about what the public was allowed to know.
Chapter 3. The cover-up begins.
Within hours of General Ramey's weather balloon press conference, a machinery of silence descended on everyone who had been close to the Roswell incident. The speed and thoroughness of this silence operation would itself become, for later investigators, one of the most striking indicators that something extraordinary was being concealed. Rancher Mac Brazel, who had reported the debris to the sheriff and spoken briefly to the press about his discovery, was taken into military custody, not formally arrested, but held at the base for several days. When he finally re-emerged and spoke to reporters again, his story had changed entirely. The material he described was now mundane, some rubber, tinfoil, and sticks, nothing unusual. His neighbors later said he seemed different, quieter, more guarded. He declined to discuss the subject further for the rest of his life. When pressed, he would say only that he wished he had never reported finding anything. Sheriff George Wilcox, who had been the first official to receive Brazel's report and who then contacted the military, similarly went silent. His wife and daughters later recounted that military personnel had come to the sheriff's office and delivered what the family understood as a direct threat. If Wilcox ever spoke about what he knew, not only his life, but the lives of his entire family would be in danger. The sheriff was a man who had built his career on civic duty and public service. After 1947, he would not discuss Roswell. He lost his appetite for public life.
His family believed the visit from the military men broke something in him permanently.
Major Jesse Marcel occupied a particularly difficult position. He was the intelligence officer who had physically handled the original debris and who had made the initial assessment that it was something extraordinary. He was also a military officer who had sworn an oath and understood the consequences of violating security directives. For 30 years, Marcel said nothing publicly about Roswell. He left the military, built a civilian career, and carried what he knew in silence. But the silence was not comfortable, and it was not total. He told people close to him, his wife, his son, trusted friends, that the weather balloon story was a cover story, that what he had found on the Foster Ranch was not of this earth, that he had been ordered to participate in a deception, to pose with substitute debris for photographs, to let the lie become the official record. He lived with this for 3 decades before finally speaking to researcher Stanton Friedman in 1978, and when he did, the floodgates of the Roswell story opened again after 30 years of enforced quiet. The pattern of intimidation extended throughout the community. Military personnel who had been assigned to the recovery operation, civilian witnesses who had been near the debris field or the base during the critical days, medical staff at the base hospital, all described in testimony gathered over subsequent decades a systematic campaign of threats and coercion. The message was consistent across multiple independent accounts. You did not see what you think you saw. You will say nothing about it, and if you do speak, you will regret it.
The cover-up, if that is what it was, operated on multiple levels simultaneously. At the official level, the weather balloon explanation was locked in place and defended with the full institutional authority of the United States military. At the community level, witnesses were silenced through a combination of direct threats, security oaths, and the enormous social pressure that the military's authority created in a small New Mexico city that was economically and culturally dependent on the air base. At the documentary level, records were systematically removed. A General Accounting Office investigation conducted in 1994 would discover that all administrative records from Roswell Army Airfield, covering the period from March 1945 through December 1949, had been destroyed, a period that should have included voluminous documentation of the incident and its aftermath. Under the law, those records should have been preserved. They were gone. In their place, silence and the official explanation of a weather balloon and the faint but persistent testimonies of people who had been there and who knew with the particular certainty of direct experience that the explanation was not the truth.
Chapter 4: The Bodies They Never Showed Us. Of all the elements of the Roswell mystery, none is more disturbing, more viscerally compelling, or more persistently denied than the question of the bodies. The wreckage of an unknown craft is one thing, exotic, strange, potentially explainable by classified technology we simply haven't seen before. But bodies are different. Bodies are biological. Bodies mean passengers. Bodies mean that whatever came down on the Foster Ranch was not an unmanned probe or an experimental drone. It was a vehicle carrying living creatures, and those creatures did not survive the crash. If the bodies are real, then the question of what fell at Roswell is answered with a certainty that no weather balloon explanation can touch. The testimony about bodies comes from multiple independent sources gathered across decades, and the accounts share enough specifics to be striking. The beings described were consistently small, approximately 4 to 5 feet tall, with disproportionately large heads and large dark eyes. Their skin was described as grayish or pale. Their fingers were longer than human fingers, and they had 4 of them. Their bodies were slight, almost fragile looking, the limbs thin.
The faces were virtually featureless, small slit-like mouths, no visible ears or nose in the conventional sense, no hair. They did not look like the monsters of science fiction films. They looked, by the accounts of those who claimed to have seen them, like something that had evolved under very different conditions than the ones that produced human beings, recognizably organic, but alien in the most literal possible sense.
Frank Kaufman, who identified himself as a former Army counterintelligence agent with direct involvement in the Roswell recovery operation, provided one of the most detailed accounts. He described a second crash site, separate from the debris field that Brazel had found, where the primary craft had impacted with greater violence. At this site, Kaufman said recovery teams found 5 bodies. 4 were outside the craft, 1 was inside, still partially strapped in what appeared to be a seat or restraint of some kind. The exterior bodies had been exposed to the elements for several days by the time the teams arrived, and they showed signs of deterioration. The one inside the craft was in better condition. All 5 were removed with the greatest care, wrapped in protective material, and transported in sealed containers to the base hospital for preliminary examination before being shipped to higher security facilities. Glenn Dennis, the local mortician who had received the unusual call from the base asking about hermetically sealable caskets, represents one of the most intriguing peripheral witnesses. The request itself for caskets of specific dimensions, smaller than standard adult caskets, capable of maintaining an airtight seal, was peculiar enough to lodge in his memory. When he drove to the base hospital that same afternoon, he was physically confronted by military police and ordered to leave immediately. But before he was removed, he passed an open area and glimpsed what appeared to be large pieces of wreckage, strange-looking material, and at least one stretcher bearing a covered form that was clearly not human in its proportions.
The nurse he later spoke with, a colleague he identified only as Naomi Self, was shaken and told him she had assisted at the examination of 3 small beings with large heads, whose bodies had produced a terrible, overwhelming odor. She had sketched the beings for him on a napkin. Within days, she was gone, transferred to England, her letters to Dennis increasingly brief and strange, and then nothing. She was never located by researchers. No military record of a nurse matching her description has ever been confirmed. The black and white autopsy film that surfaced in 1995, presented by British entrepreneur Ray Santilli as authentic footage of a post-Roswell examination, briefly seemed to offer visual confirmation of what witnesses had been describing for decades. The black and white film showed what appeared to be a non-human body being examined by figures in protective suits in a stark clinical room. It captured the attention of the entire world, was broadcast in dozens of countries, and became one of the most watched documentary films of the decade. Then, years later, Santilli acknowledged that the footage was a recreation, but maintained that it was based on genuine original footage that had degraded beyond use, and that the recreation was as faithful to the original as he could make it. Whether this explanation is itself true, partially true, or a further layer of obfuscation, no one outside the production knows. What is certain is that the film succeeded in burning the visual image of the Roswell beings into global consciousness. The bodies had faces now, even if those faces were fabricated, and the fabrication, paradoxically, made it harder, not easier, to look away.
Chapter 5. Witness After Witness. Deathbed Confessions.
There is a particular weight to deathbed testimony. when a person knows they are dying, when the calculations of career, reputation, and personal safety that shape behavior throughout a lifetime no longer apply, the things they choose to say carry a different quality than the claims made in healthier times. The Roswell case has accumulated an unusual number of deathbed testimonies, accounts given by witnesses in their final days or hours when they had, as they often explicitly stated, nothing left to lose and everything to answer for before whatever judgment awaited them. The cumulative volume of this testimony from military officers, medical personnel, civilians with no apparent motive to fabricate forms one of the most difficult evidentiary challenges that the weather balloon explanation has to face. Walter Haut, the officer who issued the original July 8 press release, spent decades publicly saying little about Roswell beyond what he had officially stated in 1947. He was a respected figure in the Roswell community, one of the founders of the International UFO Museum, and he navigated the line between acknowledging the phenomenon's cultural significance and saying nothing that would contradict the official record. But in 2002, he gave a sealed affidavit, a formal legal declaration witnessed and signed with explicit instructions that it was not to be opened until after his death. Haut died in 2005. When the affidavit was opened and published in 2007, what it contained was extraordinary. Haut stated under oath that he had personally seen the recovered craft, not just the debris field wreckage, but an intact craft, and that he had seen alien bodies. He described attending a meeting where the actual material was discussed and the decision was made to substitute the weather balloon story for public consumption.
Jesse Marcel Jr. maintained throughout his adult life that what his father had shown him in the early morning hours of July 8, 1947, on the kitchen floor of their home before the debris was delivered to the base was genuinely extraordinary. Marcel Jr. became a military officer himself, serving as a flight surgeon in the Montana Army National Guard and flying combat missions in Iraq. He was not a credulous man or a sensationalist. He was precise, careful, and deliberate in the claims he made. He described the materials his father spread on the floor, the strange metallic foil that could not be crumpled, the I-beam with its purple-hued hieroglyphic symbols, the impossibility of identifying any of it as belonging to any known category of materials. He said his father told him directly that it was a flying saucer. Jesse Marcel Jr. died in 2013, and until his final days, he never altered or retracted his account. It was what it was. He had seen what he had seen, and his father had told him what it was, and no official explanation had ever satisfactorily accounted for the materials he had held in his own hands as a child. Sergeant Melvin Brown was a cook assigned to the 509th Bomb Group who was, according to his daughter's testimony given after his death, present during the transport of alien bodies from the crash site to the base. His family described him as a man not given to storytelling or exaggeration, but in his final years he began to talk to his family about what he had seen in the summer of 1947. He had been assigned to guard a transport vehicle. He had been told not to look under the tarpaulin covering the cargo, but he looked. Beneath the tarpaulin were bodies, small, strange, with large heads and what appeared to be slits for eyes. He described the skin as yellowish. He swore his daughters to say nothing while he was alive. When he was dying, he asked them to remember what he told them. Told them it was real.
These accounts do not exist in isolation. They form a pattern that crosses decades, that involves people with no connection to one another, that shares specific details, the small stature, the large heads, the skin color, the transport procedures, the threats to silence.
Researchers who have spent careers cataloging this testimony are aware of its limitations. Memory is fallible. Deathbed confession is not the same as verified fact. And the cultural saturation of alien imagery that occurred between 1947 and the decades when most of this testimony was gathered creates a contamination problem that serious investigation must acknowledge. But the sheer volume, the specificity, and the consistency of these accounts, from decorated military officers to ordinary soldiers to civilian witnesses with nothing to gain and sometimes much to lose, constitutes something that the official record has never fully, credibly answered. Chapter 6. The official explanations, weather balloons, and crash test dummies.
In 1994, 47 years after the incident, the United States Air Force published a formal report, the Roswell Report, Fact versus Fiction in the New Mexico Desert. The report identified the debris recovered from the Foster Ranch as belonging to Project Mogul, a classified high-altitude balloon program designed to detect Soviet nuclear tests using acoustic sensors carried aloft on enormous balloon trains that could stretch over 600 feet in length. The balloons were constructed from materials that included aluminum foil, neoprene, and balsa wood reinforced with tape bearing geometric floral patterns that could, the report conceded, be misidentified as unusual symbols or hieroglyphics by someone unfamiliar with the program. Flight number 4 from the Mogul series launched from Alamogordo, New Mexico on June 4, 1947, had lost tracking. Atmospheric physicist Charles Moore calculated that the balloon's trajectory could have brought it down precisely in the area of the Foster Ranch debris field. 3 years later, in 1997, the Air Force published a second report, the Roswell Report, Case Closed. This one addressed the question that the 1994 report had notably not touched, the alien bodies. The explanation the Air Force offered was, to put it charitably, creative. The witnesses who described seeing small, strange bodies with large heads had, the report concluded, confused their memories of multiple separate events. The bodies were crash test dummies, human-sized featureless mannequins used in high-altitude parachute experiments conducted in the early 1950s as part of Operation High Dive. Witnesses, the report argued, had conflated these disparate events that occurred up to 12 years after 1947, into a single false memory of alien bodies at Roswell.
The problems with these explanations are multiple and, for many investigators, fatal. The Project Mogul explanation accounts for the debris field, or at least offers a plausible mechanism for it. What it does not explain is the initial press release. If the recovered material was clearly balloon debris to any trained military eye, why did the intelligence officer of the 509th Bomb Group describe it as a flying disc? Major Marcel was not a naive farmhand. He was an experienced officer trained to identify military and civilian aircraft and equipment. The suggestion that he could not distinguish balloon debris from something genuinely anomalous strains credibility, and Marcel himself rejected it explicitly. Beyond Marcel, why was a brigadier general required to personally issue a correction for a weather balloon? The bureaucratic machinery deployed to shut down this story was absurdly disproportionate to the story being shut down, if the truth was simply a stray balloon. The crash test dummy explanation for the bodies encountered an even more fundamental problem: chronology. The alien body testimony described events in July 1947. Operation High Dive, the parachute experiment program that used the crash test dummies, did not begin until 1953, 6 years later. The Air Force's own report acknowledged this timeline, but argued that time compression could explain how 1953 dummy recoveries became 1947 alien bodies in witnesses' recollections. Time compression of this magnitude, 6 to 12 years of retroactive memory distortion, has no precedent in the psychological literature on eyewitness memory. For the investigators who have spent careers on this case, the 1994 and 1997 Air Force reports are not the end of the story. They are additional data points in the evidence for a cover-up. The fact that the government waited 47 years to provide an explanation, and then provided an explanation that raised as many questions as it answered, and then 3 years later provided a second explanation specifically calibrated to address the most damaging testimony. This is the behavior of an institution managing a story it has been managing for decades.
Chapter 7, Area 51 and the Trail That Never Ends.
No discussion of Roswell is complete without following the trail where most investigators believe the recovered material ultimately went, to a stretch of classified Nevada desert known as Area 51. The facility officially did not exist for decades. The United States government denied its very presence until 2013, when declassified documents finally confirmed what satellite imagery, eyewitness accounts, and 50 years of rumor had long established, that a massive, deeply classified research installation operated at Groom Lake, Nevada, roughly 83 miles north of Las Vegas. The facility was real. The secrecy around it was real. The question was, and remains, what exactly was being kept there, and why the security apparatus surrounding it was of a scale and intensity that seemed, to many observers, disproportionate even to the most sensitive conventional military programs. The connection between Roswell and Area 51 was dramatically amplified in 1989 when a physicist named Bob Lazar appeared on a Las Vegas television station and made claims that immediately captured global attention. Lazar said he had been hired through a contractor to work at a facility he called S4, located adjacent to Area 51, where his job was to study and attempt to understand the propulsion systems of recovered alien spacecraft. He described 9 craft of various configurations, all stored in hangar bays carved into a desert hillside. He described a propulsion mechanism based on the element 115, at that time an undiscovered element that did not appear on the periodic table, a detail that Lazar's supporters would later point to as eerily prescient when element 115, moscovium, was officially synthesized in 2003.
The deeper trail that many investigators follow leads not just to Area 51, but to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, another facility that surfaces repeatedly in Roswell testimony as a destination for the recovered craft and bodies. Multiple witnesses described shipments going to Wright-Patterson. Senator Barry Goldwater, the 1964 Republican presidential candidate and a decorated military pilot with top security clearances, was himself a serious UFO investigator who made repeated requests to his friend General Curtis LeMay for access to a room at Wright-Patterson where alien material was allegedly stored. LeMay's response, Goldwater recounted, was the most forceful rejection of his life, an explicit profanity-laden directive to never raise the subject again. Goldwater, a man accustomed to the highest levels of classified military information, found LeMay's reaction itself informative.
A man does not respond with that intensity to a request about weather balloons. The thread of the Roswell story runs through all of modern UFO investigation, and in the last decade has connected to developments that would have seemed fantastical even to the most committed believers of previous decades. In 2017, the New York Times published a front-page story revealing the existence of the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, a previously secret government program that had been studying UFO encounters reported by military pilots. In 2023, former intelligence officer David Grush testified before Congress under oath, claiming that the United States government had been operating crash retrieval and reverse engineering programs for non-human craft for decades, programs he described as legacy programs originating in an earlier era. Grush did not name Roswell explicitly, but the implication was clear to everyone listening. The thread that began in 1947 in a New Mexico desert was still unspooling, still reaching forward through time, still refusing to be tied off.
Chapter 8. What Roswell Really Means.
Nearly 8 decades after a rancher found debris scattered across his land in the New Mexico desert, the Roswell incident remains unsolved in the only way that genuinely matters, in the hearts and minds of those who have examined the evidence carefully and found that the official explanation does not hold the weight placed upon it. The weather balloon, Project Mogul explanation may account for some elements of the physical debris. It does not account for the initial press release, the speed of the cover-up, the systematic intimidation of witnesses, the destruction of records, the deathbed testimonies of military officers, the destroyed administrative files, and the strange behavior of General Curtis LeMay when a man with full security clearance asked a simple question about a classified room. These are not the residue of a balloon crash. They are the residue of something else entirely. What Roswell really means cannot be separated from the moment in which it occurred. July 1947 was the hinge of the modern world, the point at which the old certainties of human civilization came unmoored. The atomic bomb had already established that humanity could destroy itself. The Cold War had established that the entities most capable of that destruction were locked in existential competition. Into this atmosphere arrived something that neither superpower had made, something that flew at speeds and in patterns that violated the physics of everything either side had managed to build. If that something was real, if the witnesses were telling the truth, if the initial press release was accurate and the weather balloon story was the lie, then the implications are staggering, and the decision to conceal them, while monstrous in its contempt for public truth, is at least comprehensible as an act of governance confronting the incomprehensible.
The conspiracy culture that Roswell created, and it did create it as surely as Gutenberg created print media, follows a template that has been applied to every major contested event of the subsequent decades. Official explanation contradicted by witness testimony, records conveniently unavailable, institutional authority deployed to close questions that remain open. This template, once established, becomes self-perpetuating. Once the public has been given reason to believe that official explanations are substitutes for truth rather than expressions of it, every official explanation becomes suspect.
The damage to institutional trust that Roswell inflicted on American civic culture has compounded with interest across 8 decades. Every subsequent cover-up, every classified document, every national security invocation that ends a congressional inquiry, these are paid for in part with the credibility spent at a press conference in Fort Worth, Texas on July 9, 1947, when a weather balloon was offered as an explanation for something that a military press release had already described as a flying disc. In the end, what Roswell really means is this: the most powerful government in the world, in the most powerful moment of its history, encountered something it could not explain, and its response was to reach for silence. The silence has held, imperfectly, leaking at the edges, stained by the testimony of those who could not carry it to their graves without speaking. But it has held, and the holding of it, the active, systematic, decades-long maintenance of an explanation that does not satisfy the evidence, is itself the most eloquent statement the United States government has ever made about what it found on a ranch in New Mexico in the summer of 1947. They found something, they took it, they buried the truth, and somewhere in the architecture of classified files and sealed affidavits and destroyed records, the answer still exists. It is waiting, as it has been waiting for nearly 80 years, for the day when it is finally allowed to surface. And when it does, nothing will be the same.